Good evening. Welcome to Specters and Electors, Foreign Influence on U.S. Elections. I am Dr. David Hinksman. I am the former Director of Debate and Associate Professor Emeritus in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Iowa. This presentation begins the annual speaker series of the A. Craig Baird Debate Forum at the University of Iowa. Tonight's speaker is a distinguished alumnus of the forum and of this university, Dr. Michael Jensen. Mike came to our forum and to the university from Thousand Oaks, California. He loves academic debate, as do all of us, and research was always his strongest suit. After graduating, Mike helped us out as an assistant coach for several years and continues to talk to our debaters via email in Australia. Then he returned to California and entered the PhD program in political science at the University of California, Irvine. He is now associate professor at the Center for Change Governments at the University of Canberra in Australia. Mike specializes in studying information warfare and propaganda. He also serves as a consultant and a researcher for the Australian Department of Defence. He's widely published in major edited book collections and journal articles, and we are very grateful that he has not flown over Iowa, but come here to stay here to give 2 presentations this week. And so let me talk a little bit about his topic. Now, I'm a recent retiree, so I spend a lot of time watching TV and getting free websites, news websites, because I can't afford to get past the paywall. But it is frustrating to see alarming headlines and capsule summaries of current events. And since 2016, in particular, there's been a lot of talk about foreign interference in U.S. elections. But that talk has generally been devoid of any details about what that interference actually is. So in the spirit of academic debate, which tries to go beyond the headlines into the heart of issues, Mike is going to give you those details, and he's not going to set up a paywall for those of you who are on Zoom. He will examine the past, present, and future of foreign election interference with the depth of his extensive research base on this issue. So please welcome Dr. Michael Jensen back to the University of Iowa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dave, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Paul Bells for making this event possible. Without Paul, this event wouldn't be possible, and not only that, he had a significant impact on my debate career at the University of Iowa, encouraging me to continue through, even when my performance didn't achieve the objectives that I'd hoped at tournaments. It was to help me see the team objective. And in a lot of ways, the success of the Iowa debaters is something that I found most satisfying as I work with them. And Dr. Dave, of course, I'm overjoyed that he came back for this event. I, of course, haven't seen him in over 20 years. But Dr. Dave had a significant impact as well on not only my debate career, but my academic career. Prior to coming to grad school, he and I talked a lot about academic life, and he encouraged me to pursue an academic career. Dr. Dave had always been, for me, the exemplar of an intellect whose brilliance was only eclipsed by his generosity of time and so forth. And that really served me in terms of thinking through what I wanted to do post-debate and going to grad school, becoming an academic. And the other thing is that I remember a conversation where he encouraged me to do some work with Professor David Easton, who has turned out to be one of the most prominent professors of political science at the University of California, Irvine. At the time, the choice did not seem so obvious, but as I look back, it was obviously the right choice, and you'll see election interference. And I hope to present these issues in a little bit of a novel way, a way that many of you probably haven't seen them presented before. You'll notice from the start, I have some issues with some of the terms that we use a lot, like fake news or misinformation or disinformation, because I don't think that they're terribly helpful. Now, to begin with, I'm going to go through some theoretical preliminaries. After all, I am an academic, but I hope this is not going to be just a perfunctory genuflection to my dissertation committee, but rather a way of trying to explain things using terminologies that are more useful. And they've been more useful in some of the work that I've done previously for the Australian Department of Defense and some other entities as well. Then I'm going to go into election interference in the 2016 and 2020 elections. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've already observed happening in the lead up to the 2022 midterms. And then I'm going to talk about potential future forms of interference, drawing on insights from around the world. Now, to begin with, if we think about how deception happens in the course of any sort of actor trying to interfere in our elections or interfere in our politics more generally, because they can do that outside of election times. Communication involves three basic elements. You have a messenger, you have content that's being sent in that message, and you have an audience. And any one of these can be targeted with various means of inducing deception. There's information laundering, and that's akin to like money laundering, where somebody takes dirty money from, say, mafia activities and puts it through a restaurant in order to clean it and make it look legitimate. In the same way, governments have used for a long time other front organizations to take content from their intelligence services and present them to an audience that otherwise would rightfully and skeptically view that information. So, for example, some of the most effective influence operations that the Soviets did during the Cold War included taking otherwise true stories about racialized violence in America and distributing them through front organizations in Africa as a means to curb US influence across the continent. If audiences knew that this was a KGB operation, they would be more skeptical, and rightfully so. But the fact that it was sent through other organizations led people to be more likely to receive that and consider, is the United States a good partner for us based upon this information? They don't have anything that would lead them to negatively evaluate it. And importantly, this is a case that exemplifies some of the most effective of influence operations involve not false information, but actually true information that's presented to people in a way that are more likely to receive it. Additionally, there's a technique called truthing. I encourage you, any of you who are interested to understand more of this, to look for the Yes Men and the BBC on YouTube later on. There's an example where there was a comedy group called the Yes Men, who are social activists as well. They managed to convince a BBC producer that they were representatives of Dow Chemical shortly after Dow Chemical bought out Union Carbide. And they presented a story that said, now that we are the owners of Union Carbide, we are going to take responsibility for the Bhopal chemical disaster that happened in India, and we are going to properly compensate all of the victims of that tragedy. Now, the content they wanted to get across to the public was, hey, there was a massive tragedy there, which Union Carbide never owned up to, and they never properly compensated the victims. Many people died, and many other people continue to live with chronic health effects, and that's what they're trying to put out there. But they lied about who they were in order to get on TV to get that message out. Now, in terms of content, we often hear about fake news, and that's news outlets or outlets that present themselves as being legitimate news outlets when they in fact are really not. They don't adhere to standards of journalistic practice that include getting sources, verifying information, trying to present things in a fairly informational, so-called objective way, as opposed to trying to convince an audience of a predetermined position. Additionally, a lot of people talk about misinformation, which is the transmission of factually false information, but often unintentionally so. Disinformation is similar to misinformation, except that there's a difference in terms of you're focusing on the producer as an intentional deceiver, as opposed to the true believer who's just passing along false information. And then on top of that, you have a variety of other mechanisms that include things like censorship, which doesn't include the transmission of false information, but it often involves the blockage of true information. So, for example, to prevent discourses about human rights and democracy in the People's Republic of China, they will often restrict conversations about those topics, and you're not allowed to talk in public about the tragedy of Tiananmen Square and how many people died. In addition, there's a lot of other mechanisms by which information can be controlled, and that involves a lot of things about how you select the relevant context, or reduce the context to something that may be quite trivial when situated in a wider context may lead people to have a different understanding. The tone that's used, often a lot of bureaucratic language can reduce the significance of something as opposed to presenting something in really dramatic language. So many of you may have seen on social media a year or two ago, there was a campaign or a thing going around where people would say, describe your favorite movie using the most banal tone or descriptions possible. So you might say something like, the movie 2001 was a story about a computer glitch that inadvertently killed the crew of Space Explorers. The lone survivor continued the mission, reports back he saw lots of stars. All of that's factually true, but it really takes you away from how dramatic all of these events were. And that's a way in which you can control the reaction that people might have. Finally, the audience could be targeted. And that includes a lot of different mechanisms that are bundled under what the Russian doctrine of reflex control involves, where it's choosing the manner in which people receive information and respond to information, where certain things might be highlighted or captured, while other things might be reduced from their view. So it's a lot of the getting people's attention through some bright and shiny object that draws controversy. Meanwhile, you deflect against a lot of other things that are happening. Or alternatively, that may involve flooding certain messages, that is, releasing high volumes and talking to a great extent about a particular topic as a way of trying to reinforce a particular point of view. And research in public opinion indicates the more you receive a certain message, not only are you more likely to believe that, it also is able to normalize what you might initially see as an extreme view, and that also increases your receptivity to articulate that position as your own. Now, how does foreign influence cause problems for political systems? You notice I have a skepticism towards focusing only on false information, as true information can be used to affect many aspects of political life. And the primary mechanism through which they do so is to target what's called political support. And this is drawing upon Dave Easton's account of systems analysis. There are two kinds of political support that you can find in a system. One is called specific support, and that refers to support for specific outputs. So it may be that, for example, in the context of the war in Ukraine, you might find people trying to convince the public here in the United States that, hey, maybe life would be better off if we didn't give so much support to Ukraine. And so maybe we ought to spend more of that 40 billion, 50 billion that's been allocated to Ukraine to alleviate inflation here at home. Likewise, they may target what's called diffuse support, and that is that kind of generalized trust or belief in legitimacy of various elements of a political system. And political systems are composed of the authorities, they're composed of the people, what's called the political community, and the basic overall constitutional order. And these may be targeted through various activities that, for example, as we saw in 2016, seek to support or oppose a particular candidate for election. We saw, for example, the Russians were initially targeting Hillary Clinton, trying to undermine support for Hillary Clinton's candidacy, and then when they thought Donald Trump had a chance to win, they actively sought to help Donald Trump win. Additionally, they may target the citizens of the political community by seeking to divide and polarize them, which makes it much harder to govern when additional resources, rhetorical and sometimes material, need to be expended in order to get a policy accepted and get buy-in across the public. And particularly with the hope that your party might get, or your president might get reelected later on. They can also seek to confuse and demobilize the public by, for example, spreading lots of contradictory messages, as Jacques Ellul talks about in his classic work on propaganda, if you inundate a person with information, you do not inform them more, you just drown them in information. They often don't know what to do with it. And that's a classic Russian tactic where they throw pretty much everything at the wall to see what sticks, but at the same time they also know if they confuse an audience enough, then that audience doesn't know if they should support or oppose something, and that makes it harder for leaders to act decisively because they don't have the ability to act with the full support of the public behind them. Finally, they may attack the political regime or the constitutional order. And a lot of this is thought of in terms of this general battle of the West versus the rest, or showing that one system is morally superior or inferior inherently. When COVID was the main issue that people are talking about, you had discussions about whether authoritarian regimes are just more capable of keeping COVID under control than democracies, and whether democracies have simply become ungovernable in facing major crises like COVID. So these are major ways in which foreign governments will continually try to erode at their adversaries. If their constitutional order is in question, that can give rise to people feeling less secure. And when people feel less secure, they're more open to more radical options. It nulls our concerns about particular norms, because if we start to lose faith in democracy as the best or only system that we're willing to accept to govern us, then we might be willing to say, hey, it's all right if we suspend an election here or there, or worry about whether or not something was free and fair with respect to respecting rights of full and equal participation in an election, because what's important is the results, that we get the favored policies, that we get the people in office that will do what we want to do. So, I'm going to talk about this first of all in terms of what happened in 2016. Now, this is a day-by-day summation of the trolling activity from the Internet Research Agency, basically from its inception, the earliest account records that we have from about 2009 up and through the middle of 2019, when 2018, sorry, when these accounts were taken down en masse by Twitter. You can see some of the biggest spikes occur after MH17, the flight that left Amsterdam and was shot down over Ukraine. That generated a significant amount of activity, and those spikes in the early going are in reference to various activities in the investigation. The most active day, though, for these accounts during the 2016 election was oddly October 6th. It's strange that it was October 6th because that day there really wasn't much going on. Hillary Clinton was in the middle of debate preparation, and Donald Trump gave a town hall in New Hampshire, but not a whole lot. However, October 7th, that was a doozy of a day. At about 3:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, and James Clapper, who was the Director of National Intelligence, announced that the Russians were interfering in the election in order to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton's candidacy. About an hour later, we had the Access Hollywood tape drop. And then at about 5 p.m. that afternoon, we had the first of a batch of John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's emails being released by WikiLeaks. Oh, it was also Vladimir Putin's birthday that day. This is what those tweets look like on an hourly by hourly basis. And that big spike starting on the morning of October 6th, that's 7 a.m. Eastern U.S. time. And it continued through 5 a.m. Eastern U.S. time on that Friday. Meanwhile, all that stuff was going on that Friday, October 7th. It's more or less crickets by comparison. Now that's highly curious. And so I sat back and thought, well, what could possibly explain this? You wouldn't preemptively celebrate Vladimir Putin's birthday. You'd have those tweets definitely on the 7th. Clearly they're trying to target the United States, given they started at exactly 7 a.m. Eastern U.S. time. They wanted to do something that day for some particular purpose. Now, in terms of the Access Hollywood tape, it doesn't seem plausible that they had noticed that that was going to be released at that point in time. Based on the reporting, it seemed that there was a disgruntled NBC employee who had access to the tape and decided to go send it out. Unclear how the Russians would have known that ahead of time in order to inform the Internet Research Agency's activity, and it was very clear that the campaign was scrambling when David Fahrenthold, who was then a reporter for the Washington Post, called them up for comment. In fact, there were efforts to reach out to WikiLeaks at that point by James Corsi, who was a supporter of Donald Trump and loosely associated with the campaign, but they didn't seem to be very effective in making that contact, and Mueller's report was unable to establish that connection. So it doesn't seem that it was a response to also the Access Hollywood tape. There's a question about whether or not it would have been that they were preemptively trying to prime audiences to be receptive to the content of Podesta emails. However, if you look at the previous big WikiLeaks release, which started on the 22nd of July, when they had the Democratic National Committee emails they released, you see no such similar patterns, so that doesn't seem to fit. So I searched for similar patterns. I found one, only one, where there was a massive increase of more than one standard deviation of activity that was sustained for more than 12 hours, and the Internet Research Agency apparently works in 12-hour shifts, so that would involve tasking across multiple shifts this level of activity. The day that happened, September 16th. What was happening September 16th? Again, not very much. Donald Trump gave a very short speech in which he said he was renouncing birtherism, or actually he said he was ending birtherism, blamed Hillary Clinton for starting it, and then took reporters on a tour of his Washington, D.C. hotel. Now, the interesting thing is, why would they do that? Well, it turns out on the 13th, so 3 days earlier, there was a small WikiLeaks release which included an email which indicated that when Jay Johnson applied for a job with the Obama administration, he was put with a list of other people amongst those who had given donations to the Democratic National Committee. Very ordinary practice, although maybe some people who are unfamiliar with this may think there's a scandal. Anyhow, that was written up by a blogger from who writes for the New York Observer, a newspaper at the time that was owned by Jared Kushner, and this was an individual who was a supporter of Bernie Sanders, written up as this is a scandalous example of the pay-to-play schemes that operated during the Obama years, and that extension casting a shadow of corruption on all the people associated with Obama, including Hillary Clinton. The following day, that was picked up by a blog called something like Counter Jihad Watch. This blog, if you try to go to today, it says that it's locked and you can't access the content, although I did at the time get screenshots and save PDFs of it. There were some interesting links where it picked up on the story and added a few extra details, such as Jay Johnson had attended a counterterrorism conference which included members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, it turns out that at one point in time, the Muslim Brotherhood was running the government in Egypt, and they're also part of the parliamentary representation in Kuwait, and Egypt and Kuwait were both counterterrorism partners for the United States. So if you knew those details, that would not be surprising, but if you don't know those details, again, going back to this idea of a lot of what is manipulative out there involves selecting only certain details and not providing the full context. That sounds rather scandalous. And this story was punctuated by references to a number of tweets, which later came from accounts which we discovered had been suspended by Twitter for various terms of service violations. That article was kicked around a lot as these tweets were kicking off on the 16th, but what was kicking off the morning of the 17th was at about 8:30 in the morning in Seaside, New Jersey, there was an improvised explosive device that went off the starting line for a Marine Corps charity race. And that evening in Manhattan, there was another improvised explosive device that went off and injured 30 people. And the tweets from the Internet Research Agency were talking about this stuff nonstop throughout this whole process. And in fact, they died down for a little bit when it kind of dropped off the radar, but when the suspect, who was later caught and convicted as a lone wolf terrorist, was involved in a shootout, and these events were going on in the news, that's when they picked up again on the following Tuesday. Now, Looking at the content of the tweets, you can see the blue bars of the number of tweets per day referencing the birtherism conspiracy to see if it had anything to do with echoing that. And you can see that, sure, there's a pickup in that, and there certainly was a lot of engagement in terms of retweets and tweet likes and so forth about that issue. And they certainly were tweeting a lot about that on the 17th as well. But it became even more significant, the consistency of the number of tweets they had about Islamist terrorism. And the number of retweets and tweet likes picked up there too. In fact, even after they died off, it still had an echo effect on the Monday and Tuesday. Even though there's very little activity, there was more retweeting and more tweet likes, more engagement with that because of the events that were happening in the news. So what does that tell us? Well, I already ruled out with respect to the October 6th tweet storm. I mean, the day in which they decided they had to do the most activity, it probably wasn't in relationship to some communication, some coordination between the campaign and the Internet Research Agency, and there was no evidence that Mueller found of that. It probably had nothing to do with any sort of priming for WikiLeaks release that was happening the next day. So that leaves the only other major, it probably wasn't pre-celebrating Vladimir Putin's birthday. The only other explanation that seems plausible is that they would have known that there was going to be an announcement that the Russians were interfering in the election covertly in order to help Donald Trump win and to hurt Hillary Clinton. And by extension, that would mean that somehow they probably have broken the Gang of Eight, that institution through which the most sensitive secrets are transmitted from the administration to the Congress. And it turns out, according to Jim Clapper, the week before, there had been a briefing by General Dunford to the Gang of Eight about what they were going to release that particular Friday. Now, there had been speculation that WikiLeaks was going to start to release their next batch of emails at some point earlier in the week. For some reason, they delayed it. Maybe they also, that's led to the delay in the WikiLeaks release, but it doesn't seem that was an explanation for the tweet activity. I mean, they didn't tweet that much even the days right before the election. And in fact, they went with mostly topics about Black Lives Matter, trying to suppress the African American vote, which is the same stuff they did right before the election. So it seems most plausible that their intelligence activity was behind this, because otherwise, there really isn't any explanation why that would be the day in which they would try to task so much activity towards the election endgame. The other thing is, when it came to the attacks on the 17th of September, there's some plausibility they may have known something about that too. It turns out when Matthew Whitaker took over as acting Attorney General, he gave a speech to the New York FBI Office for Counterterrorism. And during that speech, he mentioned something about this Rahimi fellow having been convicted and sent to jail, and that they had also were awaiting the extradition of one of his co-conspirators. They quickly walked that back, saying that there was an editing error and somehow that things got merged together. But that doesn't seem terribly plausible either, because that would have required talking about two different cases which would have appeared in different paragraphs. And it makes no sense that the sentences would have been truncated somehow and paragraphs would have been merged together. And if it's the case that there was an overseas co-conspirator for these attacks that were happening in the United States, it's quite possible through their signals intelligence they picked up some chatter about that and knew an attack was going to happen on the 17th, and that would be a way in which they would know ahead of time in order to try to carry out that particular information operation in the day right beforehand to prime an audience to think Democrats are weak on terrorism. Look, there's been a terrorist attack. It only shows our point. And they're going to handle this poorly, and it's their fault. You probably should think of another candidate to run the country. So, for those reasons, I think we need to think about things like Internet Research Agency trolling is not some people just putting some ads on Facebook or sending out some tweets, but that there's something serious behind it, especially if they're being tasked by Russia's intelligence services. They can do so in ways that are strategically damaging to the United States and its interests. And additionally, this shows there's also an effort to use these activities to shape the reception of events by putting out information as things are unfolding that people can refer to and inform their thinking about those events. So, turning to 2020. In 2020, the situation was a little bit different. I mean, sure, the Internet Research Agency had reconstituted itself in various ways, and they were tweeting to try to undermine the election in various forms. But in this case, we had an additional player, a guy named Andriy Derkach, who was a Ukrainian parliamentarian representing a pro-Russian party. Derkach had also studied at a university that started off as a KGB training facility, but later became an FSB, their domestic intelligence service. Domestic in that sense, also referring to the members of the former Soviet Union, which kind of suggests some of their thinking about how distant those countries should be from their own. This is him giving a speech about what he said was a series of corrupt activities that were perpetuated by the United States during the Obama administration. Now, the Obama administration had led a fairly rigorous anti-corruption campaign. It had been supported by the Brits, it had been supported by the International Monetary Fund, all concerned about all this aid money that we were giving to Ukraine ending up in the hands of some fairly wealthy oligarchs in the country. And that something ought to be done about it. And so Biden especially put some pressure on the government, which led to the firing of a prosecutor, their effective attorney general, a guy named Shokin, who was not too happy about it. And neither were a lot of the people who had gotten a lot of money out of this fairly corrupt system. And so they began to oppose what Biden was doing, what the Obama administration was doing in their country, and this became the background to the scandal that resulted in Trump's first impeachment. That is, they tried to turn the story around and make it a story about how Biden had corruptly tried to interfere in the politics of Ukraine and get this prosecutor fired, because it turns out that his son had worked for a company called Burisma Energy, and the owner of this company was somebody believed to be really corrupt. And that was probably true. In fact, the Brits had tried to get U.S. cooperation to get this guy's assets frozen so they could legitimately freeze them in British banks. And that was part of the backstory behind what Biden was doing. So the story was actually the opposite. That is, Shokin was not bringing a case. There was a case that had initially been open, but he wasn't active on that. There were rumors that Shokin himself was on the take, getting lots of bribes from various people not to pursue certain cases, and that was the problem. Now, this conspiracy, fortunately for researchers, was very neatly laid out, where there were, on the one hand, a series of people who were accusing people of international corruption in Ukraine. Those were the folks that they saw were on their side, on Derkach's side. And then on the other hand, there are the people who were involved in the corruption, supposedly, who were accusing others of corruption, acting in the United States. And these were folks that they were going to try to lobby to take action. And that included people like the Attorney General Barr. That also included people like Lindsey Graham, Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who in 2018 had taken a 4th of July vacation to Moscow and came back saying, I think we were a little bit hard on those Russians for their election interference in 2016. Oh, and of course, a certain Senator Chuck Grassley from the great state of Iowa. Now, they have lots of different lines going on about how this corruption was carried out and how pressure was illegitimately brought. The whole thing is that it was completely a bogus story. But that's the story that they were trying to perpetuate, and they did so by actually hiring a lobbying firm in the United States, which was registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. One of the people who ran this firm was a guy who went by the name of Andy Kuchma after changing his name from his original Ukrainian name. It turns out that when he married a wife from Canada and became a Canadian citizen, he lost his ability to continue to serve in the Ukrainian parliament, but he was still on really good terms with Andriy Derkach, and he was the go-to for Derkach in the United States to try to lobby these members of the US government. And sure enough, Grassley and Johnson had opened an investigation in the Senate to go and air all these accusations about the Bidens potentially being corrupt and having corrupt dealings in Ukraine, and how one of them had received, how Hunter Biden had received something on the order of $3 million over time from the wife of the mayor of Moscow and so forth, and this was just a terrible scandal and whatnot. No crimes, though, could they show had been committed, and nothing involving directly then candidate Biden. Now, part of this story, this filtered around lots of really fringe outlets for a long time, and I'll show you some of those domains later on that were publishing the story. But it didn't really make it in the mainstream until it was published by a guy named John Solomon, who had an opinion piece in The Hill. Now, one of the things you'll note at the bottom is it says that Solomon's columns regarding Ukraine became subject to House Intelligence Committee's impeachment inquiry on Trump, and then on the right it says, editor's note, subsequent to the publication of the op-ed, and there's a new president of Ukraine, in Yuri Lysenko, who was one of the other people who Biden pressured them to get removed. It says that he was removed and criminal proceedings have been opened against him for possible abuse of power. And also, apparently, Lysenko had said, contrary to what it said in this article, that there had been no wrongdoing by the Bidens. So all of the factual claims about the supposed Biden-Ukrainian nightmare, about him acting corruptly in Ukraine, apparently, turns out were false, but those were the claims that were made in that particular article, which appeared in early April 2019. And if you notice here, there's the blue line on this chart. That's the overall production of articles. There's trickle. Most of these things were, there are a couple things appeared in top newspapers, like there's a couple stories in the New York Times that dismissed some of the early accusations about Biden being corruptly involved with the Burisma company. There's some white propaganda that refers to the kind of overt Russian propaganda outlet stories in Russia Today. In fact, some of the earliest accusations came in as early as 2014 on Russia Today that Biden corruptly used its influence for some to get the job in the first place. And those kind of played along for a little while, but it wasn't until Solomon's article started appearing, actually the earliest one, on the 20th of March, that you see a big spike happening in terms of the reporting, and it starts to enter some, to a greater extent, mainstream, U.S. Press outlets. In fact, it was the day after that particular story I just showed you appeared in The Hill that there was a story on Solomon's reporting that appeared actually on Fox News television. Now these top 25 or 30 outlets that had articles about the Burisma scandal, most of them were like WN.com, where Jerome Kersey had worked for a number of years, and it's a fairly far-right, sketchy publication. Consortium News also kind of recycles a lot of propaganda from around the world. Veterans Today, it's got loose ties to the FSB, though they target a predominantly American veterans community, and they tend to, they published more links to known covert front organizations for the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, than any of the other sources that I looked at. Sputnik News was up there and so forth. So these are not real mainstream news sources that are covering this stuff. Now, after Solomon's reporting, these are the top outlets that we're reporting on. Fox News, MSN.com, Breitbart, Free Republic, NBC News, the Epoch Times, News.Yahoo, which is among the top 15, 20 news sites in America. The Daily Mail.co.uk actually gets a lot of readership in the United States as well. The Washington Examiner, now that's kind of more marginal, but still gets fairly good coverage in the United States, and so on. It became much more mainstream after it appeared in The Hill. Oh, and by the way, The Hill was the second most visited political news site during the 2020 US election. I looked at the inlinks to all of these articles. That is, when an article linked to some other article for support for the claims they're making. Now, it's a little bit hard to read, but most of these inlinks were to CNN reporting that happened for the most part in May. In fact, if you want to understand what might have been a source for that initial surge reporting the end of March and early April, the only links that appear here are actually to John Solomon's reporting in The Hill. Now, John Solomon's an interesting fellow because he shared attorneys with Rudy Giuliani, and he also shares attorneys with a guy named Dmitry Firtash. Dmitry Firtash was a Russian oligarch with relatively close ties to Vladimir Putin, who was in Vienna under house arrest fighting extradition to the United States on corruption charges. And Firtash put John Solomon in touch with all of these disgruntled Ukrainian prosecutors with whom he wrote about. This is the level of interest, both news search interest and general overall search interest on Google, which is one way in which you can look at kind of the pulse of people's interest in these topics. Now, you'll note that there wasn't really much attention to the topic in early 2019. It certainly did pick up substantially when this became the topic of Trump's first impeachment. And then later on, when Grassley and Johnson released the report on from their Senate committee. I wanted to know, however, how reporting influenced attention to this topic. And so I took the period of time during the impeachment scandal to see, is there a correlation between the reporting on this topic and people's interest in the news? So I used a kind of lagged regression, time series regression approach to see what would happen if reporting happened on day one, and you search for it the same day. It's hard to disentangle whether or not if the reporting happened be first, and then people searched, and the reporting happened. So these are lagged one day at a time, and I can talk a little bit more about the method behind that, but there are various models that you can use to kind of fine-tune and figure out which model most closely approaches the data. And it turns out that it wasn't so much the coverage on the internet that drove searching, but television coverage. And that's statistically significant whether or not you're looking at general Google News search or Google News search or the overall news search. That is, it seems when people saw these stories, especially in Fox News, which gave most coverage, they would then start to look up for more information on this topic, which is an indication that this stuff has effects in terms of directing people's attention to a topic. So, ghosts of election interference present. These are the main themes in the Russian press that have been talking about US midterms between the 1st of June and the 31st of August of this year. I collected the data from the global database of emotions, language, and tone, which is a great project if you want to survey very large amounts of online news, and especially if you're interested in parsing it for sentiment analysis or various forms of content and so forth. Just make sure you have a very large hard drive and a good internet connection, because there's a lot of data there. There's billions of articles that you can sit through. Anyway, the most prominent themes in the Russian press are kill, crisis, dead, various other forms of crisis, protest, people being injured, conflict, refugees, safety issues, cautions and advice, displacement, migration, fears, evacuations, kidnapping. These are the top topics in the Chinese, and these are, again, their formal, overt white propaganda outlets like the Xinhua News Agency, the Global Times, and so forth. There's a Shanghai newspaper in there as well. And their topics are very similar: kill, crisis, dead, injured, wound, protest, arrest, seize, and so forth. What are these outlets trying to do when they report on news in America? They present a very negative image. These are targeted at the incumbents because they're trying to say things are bad. And when you create that sense of anxiety, that especially with stories about people being killed, about a refugee crisis and so forth, that creates a sense of unease. And research on social psychology shows that when publics are more uneasy, they're more likely to look to alternatives. And so it seemed that both Chinese propaganda and Russian propaganda at the moment are directed towards trying to undermine the current administration and support, by extension, maybe not necessarily in favor of the Republicans, but certainly, against the current administration. Now, turning to ghosts of potential election fears in the future. This is not me trying to think of new ways in which we can cause damage to countries like the United States. This is drawn upon things that we've observed around the world. So it's ideas that surely the intelligence agencies of America's enemies have already come up with to begin with. So I'm just going to talk about how they might try to apply that in the United States and perhaps to greater effect. So one scenario is that they could use more extensively US citizens, including dual nationals, to try to manipulate the election through the creation of various forms of political action committees or funneling in money to various groups to go and pursue various electoral goals. And there's some plausibility to this. First there's people like the sanctioned oligarch Victor Vekselberg, who has been sanctioned for his support for Putin's invasion. There's been evidence that other individuals operating on behalf of Russia have been directly funneling money to US citizens. There was a recent indictment against one of them that was working with the FSB to support various groups behind the so-called Kalexic movement, which was a California secessionist movement. And there's also an investigation into a former FBI counterintelligence agent for potentially illegal collaboration with a guy named Oleg Deripaska, who was very close to Putin and was the go-to person for a guy named Klimnik, who was the person that Paul Manafort was giving polling data to. Klimnik was reported on by the US Senate as being an SVR or intelligence officer with close ties to Deripaska, and it was thought that he was the means through which campaign information and messages were being funneled to Russian intelligence during the 2016 election. So we can imagine that these assets are reactivating their ties, and they might be able to do so having learned lessons from 2016 and 2020 and figured out ways to do it more effectively in a greater scale. A second scenario is they may try to just get somebody elected to a single seat of office so they can learn, for example, the various security protocols in which they could use to break into the Congress or into party offices more effectively. I mean, obviously after 2016, a lot of lessons were learned about cybersecurity. It makes them slightly harder targets to go and collect their emails. And so it may be the case that they are going to try to get somebody in who can keep them updated on security protocols and be their effective Trojan horse. Now there's some plausibility to this. Obviously there's the past election interference that had gone on that was predicated on this idea. But also the People's Republic of China was alleged to have tried to carry this out using a candidate in Melbourne. The thing was, there was a guy who was running for office on the Liberal Party label. Now, that's very confusing to Americans because although the color of the Liberal Party was blue like Democrats in the United States, the Liberal Party understands themselves to be classically liberal and actually more culturally conservative. In any case, this guy was a car dealer who happened to run into significant financial troubles. And so all of a sudden, he found himself rather cashed up, as they would say in Australia, throwing money around all over town. And it turns out after a little while he got guilty, and the story is that he turned himself into ASIO, which is Australia's equivalent of the FBI. About a month and a half before the Australian election in 2019, they found him mysteriously dead in a hotel room in Melbourne. So, these things, at least allegedly, do happen. And in fact, we've seen even in the United States these attacks have happened. There was a number of prominent critics of the Kremlin who have wound up mysteriously dead. There was a whistleblower for the Russia Today operation a number of years ago who is claimed to, after a night of extensive drinking, happened to kill himself by falling repeatedly in his hotel room the night before he was supposed to testify to the Senate. Recently, there was a guy named Dan Rappaport who was a Latvian who had come to the United States and was a very prominent critic of Putin and criticized the Ukraine war. He was alleged to have committed suicide 15 minutes after he had made lunch plans the following week. And there was oddly a dog walking around a nearby park, allegedly with a suicide note that he'd written. He also had over $2,000 in his pocket at the time. Anyhow, what a way to go. The third scenario, they can weaponize migrant flows during a campaign. We already know that in 2020, there were lots of stories about convoys of migrants coming up across the southern border and threatening the interests of the United States. And this was used as an argument as to why Donald Trump needed to be reelected in order to prevent these migrants from causing problems in the United States. Now, there's a great deal of plausibility for this. First, Russia's used migrant flows in the past as a weapon by trying to put pressure on Europe as they caused many attacks across Syria, forcing people to flee Syria and seek refuge in Europe. Belarus, their kind of a client state of Russia, has used this specifically by offering people flights to Minsk, promising they would offer secure passage across the border into Eastern Europe so they can enter the European Union. And beyond that, curiously, Mexico has the highest number of GRU officers outside of Russia itself. What are they doing there? Are they there just for the margaritas? Or is something else going on? It's quite plausible that they could be trying to organize various forms of operations to further put pressure at politically expedient times on America's political system. So thinking about election interference, to conclude, first, I'd say don't just focus on the easy cases of clearly false information. In fact, most of what researchers at the Hamilton 68 group at the Alliance for Security and Democracy noted after spending a year of studying Russian propaganda in the United States, they find that majority of it is not clearly false information. A lot of it is just normative statements, or people saying you ought to do this, you ought to think this. You could report on, for example, a true case and use that as what somebody like Kenneth Burke might describe as a representative anecdote, such as Russia did a lot of stories, and I'll talk more about this on Tuesday, about, for example, a tribute was held in Kyiv to somebody who they claimed had Nazi sympathies many years ago, as a way to say, this is Ukraine, they're Nazi sympathizers. Well, it might be a true story, but you may have had 100 people show up in a city of over 3 million people. That's hardly representative, but if those are the only stories you hear, those are the kind of opinions you may form. Additionally, we talk a lot about the importance of fact-checking. Well, yeah, maybe it's important that truth is out there. The problem is deception and the use of a particular falsehood is only a means to get people to do something. And they'll just switch to another means to get people to do something if that particular lie seeks to achieve the end. So fact-checking fails to scale up effectively. You're far more likely to get your bang for your buck if you can legally knock these people offline rather than just trying to fact-check their way out of it. And also, fact-checking alone seeds the agenda setting of the adversary. You're much better off, if you're in the messaging, to try to change the issue to something else. Finally, look for the real target. If you take a step back and you try to figure out what are they trying to do here when they tell you a certain message, then you can start looking at ways to shift the agenda to something else. And you can focus on other ways to rebuild resilience by talking about how important our democratic norms are, maybe, when they're talking about, for example, China does it better when it comes to controlling COVID. You could then say things like, in terms of vaccine production, look, the Russian Sputnik vaccine, not nearly as effective, and it got approval in a lot of places only because there was a widespread belief that they just hacked the AstraZeneca vaccine database in order to figure out how to build their own one. And so that's a way of saying, look, democracies can deliver just as well as other countries, and they can only deliver because they're stealing it from us to begin with. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you again to Paul for arranging this, and for Dr. Dave's opening remarks. Any questions?
Those of you that are on Zoom can ask questions.
Yeah, just feel free to unmute your mics.
So, Mike, there are millions of tweets probably a day. The charts that you showed that have the big spikes in the grand scheme of the volume of communication on Twitter, what's their share?
It's quite low. I would say so. This is actually an argument that a number of prominent social scientists have raised regarding their activity. It's implausible to think that these activities could ever dominate the communications and become the majority of communications on any day in any media environment. However, I would say the way to think about it is not so much they're going to target overall public opinion, but that they work on the margins. They try to engage what are called resonances, where they find certain communities. And the Internet Research Agency does regular research in other groups as well. China has their own public opinion influencing entities. And they do research to figure out what are the terms by which we find are most successful to move this subpopulation to do something differently. And then they start to target people in that group. They'll a lot of times speak directly to some of the opinion leaders, and there have been studies that show, for example, at certain times of the day they figured out that, early in his administration, President Trump was online, and they would just bombard him with messages. And occasionally he'd retweet a few of them, and that would lead more people to follow those accounts. And that way you can get them to do stuff.
I totally take that point that it's targeted to particular, probably individuals. So on those days where you see those big preparatory spikes and then that overwhelming activity, are you able to really get into that micro data to find out who takes the bait first? Or are there particular people or group, subpopulations that are the first retweeters or the most active retweeters or likers or engagements? So that gives it the explosion of interest necessary to then translate over into mainstream press.
So, yes, it is possible to do that. In one hand, you can go, I have all of those tweets. And on top of that, I have about 160 million tweets that I collected in 2016. And I can partially work back through some of those things. I haven't filtered out all of the accounts that they were mentioning to figure out whether or not I have evidence that those accounts acted on any of those tweets, but I have done some work with a group of computer scientists and found that when it came to retweeting, first of all, the Internet Research Agency tweeters were really good at picking winners. Like, they occasionally would introduce a URL or a hashtag, but when they said something, they were more effective than pretty much any other account was in terms of getting those picked up. And in fact, they were more effective than even, according to a research team at MIT, they were more effective than a lot of prominent conservative people on Twitter, like Posobiec and Sarinovich and so forth, in getting uptake of their content. And in some cases, they even rivaled accounts like Russia Today in promoting their content. And so the fact that they did not look like they were foreign opened the door to people being more likely to receive that. So there was a high degree of bang for the buck they got out of that compared to other folks.
And I question
Dr. Dick?
the point of view of our rhetorician. I think that some of the concern about foreign interference came from people who looked at what was going on at the end of of World War II and the Korean War, where there was fear that soldiers were being brainwashed by the North Koreans, and that propaganda was becoming more effective. And so the concern is that they could actually change people's beliefs and values by their means of communication. And so I wonder, do you think that brainwashing is possible, or is it simply that by using internet communication you can shape events to reinforce the beliefs and values that people already have? Sort of the way our politicians, particularly Republicans, are trying to energize the base. That's the terms they use for it.
So I think both are possible. On the one hand, in terms of the brainwashing, think about what's happened with QAnon. I mean, there's a lot of stories about, my father, my brother, my sister, whoever, was a normal person until they got introduced to QAnon. Now, it requires usually some sort of socialization with a community of persons, and research on rumors shows that they often depend for their livelihood on having a community of believers, which gives them a few advantages. One, you can continue to respond to updated information in the terms of whatever the conspiracy theory is. And so Gary Allen Fine, other debate connections, done some research on this. The other element to that is that it gives them a source of social support, particularly when the rest of their family says, we're going to disown you. And so you do see some cases where that brainwashing effect can happen. And it's hard to imagine QAnon reaching the scale that it did without the online community to disseminate that to so many different people. Additionally, there's some research that some people have done that suggests that QAnon is not really the product of Ron Watkins, but was very early on taken over as part of the Project Latka, which was the umbrella project of which the Internet Research Agency is but one element of the Russian influence mechanisms. So that may be happening there. But on the other hand, I think there's some really good research that indicates in the main, this influence is predominantly linked to radicalizing people who are more exposed to a particular view as it is. And some research by Kate Starbird at the University of Washington shows that within discourse communities on Twitter, you could see the Internet Research Agency accounts tending to move those communities more to their poles rather than radically changing them, although they do that usually through the introductions of new issues. So I did some work with a scholar at the ANU and another colleague at the University of Canberra a couple of years ago, which showed that during the 2019 Australian election, one of the new intersections of hashtags that the Internet Research Agency introduced was to group discussions about refugees with ISIS as a way of radicalizing discourse in Australia regarding refugees and making that connection. They're the first ones to do that. And so, and that did have some flow-on effects, because that did then start to enter some more of the mainstream political discussion, saying these refugees which we've kept offshore are protecting Australia because we don't know that they're not people connected to ISIS. Question in the back?
Yeah, I have a question. When it comes to like brainwashing, I know you're talking about like QAnon and I'm presuming probably talking about Trump as well. But my question is that when you look at like the social justice warriors, and a lot of these leftists are moving towards basically wanting to socialize medicine, which we're going there anyway. That's probably a foregone conclusion. You're basically either going to have money to be able to afford quality medical care or get whatever's left over, because I know that for a fact. I'm on socialized medicine, i.e. Medicare, Medicaid. But how is it that it's not just as much of an issue on that side as it is on the other?
Well, if you look at the data, I think it is an issue on multiple sides of the partisan composition in the United States. So, for example, there was some research that was done by a scholar at UNC Chapel Hill named Dean Freelon, who indicated that accounts presenting themselves as Black or African American on Twitter, but were really part of the Internet Research Agency, were the most engaged accounts of all of the Internet Research Agency accounts. And they were quite active in that space, trying to suppress African American turnout during the 2016 election. So I don't think it's just a discussion on the right. I mean, there were ads that were run saying that essentially Hillary Clinton was no different when it came to advancing racial justice than Donald Trump was, so you might as well not vote. They're all crooked and corrupt.
That I would agree with, and I think they are all corrupt, and honestly, I think a lot of these professional politicians should resign and let somebody else take the reins for a while.
Well, I mean,
That's my personal opinion, regardless of party affiliation.
Sure. It's hard to make a judgment about individual politicians. I hope they go in for the right reasons, and public service would be at the core of what they're trying to do. And it's that kind of frustration, that disengagement, that often gives rise to those set of conditions whereby people are less willing to say, I believe in democracy. Democracy is the only way we can govern ourselves. I accept an election result. Because without those beliefs, without those norms, without the credibility of both the candidates saying, I will accept the rules of the game, and members of the public saying, I'll accept the rules of the game, our democracy is going to be lost.
Well, I think what you've done is really reveal the tool set that people that want to try to influence other people use. And if their motives are nefarious, then they'll use them for nefarious means. If they're using them for positive mobilization purposes, then they'll use them that way too. But I mean, particularly the setup piece that you provide are the tools of the trade in public policy influencing, shaping messages, emphasizing the points that you want to emphasizing while pushing the things that you don't really want to talk about down. I mean, those are the tricks of the trade.
Indeed, they are. Political marketing is, in a lot of ways, an extension of other forms of marketing. And that can be applied to policies, and selling policies just as much as it's applied to selling candidates. And it's kind of this era of celebrity politics. Obama fashioned himself in a certain sense as a celebrity. I was in Europe at the time and people were wearing Obama shirts. Donald Trump started off as a celebrity. In California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, celebrity turned politician as well. They're very skilled at marketing, and that's what's done. The only question is, are our democratic ideals being marketed still with the same vigor? Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that at some point, if people are turned against each other enough, eventually that could actually lead to conflict in this country, like something similar to like what we had in 1860? Do you think that would ever? I hope not, because that could be a real mess, because everything I've ever read about the Civil War, well, any war, for example, is never pretty. I mean, there's no winners.
Well, the Civil War was especially awful. We had families fighting against other parts of their family. Brothers fighting brothers and so forth. I hope not, but I mean, this can give rise to secessionist movements. I mean, we already have some evidence that the Internet Research Agency has been supporting them. Not only the Collexit movement, such that California might secede from the rest of the United States, but there's evidence that the GRU was active in the lead up to a vote in Catalonia to secede from the rest of Spain. There apparently were promises that they would give hundreds of millions of euros worth of Bitcoin to the government to help it become financially secure, and offers of up to 10,000 troops to help secure the territory from the Spanish National Police and military. In fact, the Spanish National Police sent large squadrons of people to various parts of Catalonia, especially to Barcelona, the day of and in the immediate aftermath of that vote. There was a lot of police beatings of people who were trying to vote or who had voted or who were protesting their presence. And that was a situation that could have very easily exploded And in fact, the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of independence, with over 2.5 million votes cast that day out of a population of 7.5 million. So, you know, these things can kick off, they can be quite damaging. And I do fear for what can happen in the United States. You know, I got in this line of work after I started to see what was happening, what they were doing in 2016, and I found it in a way therapeutic to study what gave me nightmares. So, here we are. Okay, well, I understand it's time that we wrap up. Clock in the back's not working, so I wasn't quite sure. But thank you all for joining us online, and thank you all for joining us here live in the Big Ten Theater at the Iowa Memorial Union. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Dave will have a last word.
Okay, Dr. Dave's going to have last word. Thank you, Dave.
We have some people we'd like to thank. The UI's Office of the Provost, University College, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as the generosity of our alumni for making this series possible. Please join us again on Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. Central Time for Mike Jensen's second lecture, False Flags, Russian Propaganda and the Ukraine War. In the meantime, let's thank Mike for his outstanding work. Thanks and good night.